Welcome. I'm Tom Hinckley, Interim Director of the University of Washington School of Forest Resources. On behalf of the school and the College of the Environment, welcome to the 2011 Sustaining Our Northwest World Lecture, Sustaining Forests and Sustaining Ourselves, Trees as Providers and Inspiration for Our Lives. This lecture is the first in a series of events and programs that our school is sponsoring to celebrate 2011 as the United Nations declared International Year of Forests. These events will include the Denman Forestry Issues series, also seen on UW-TV. Both series contribute to the school's vision of world-class knowledge and leadership for the stewardship of natural resources and the environment for our own and future generations. I encourage you to visit our website at www.cfr.washington.edu to learn more about our research, education, and outreach programs. We are pleased to present this lecture in partnership with the College of the Environment, of which our school is a founding unit. We are also grateful for the support of the Lockwood Endowment in Program Enhancement in the School of Forest Resources. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Nalini Nadkarni, alumnus of the School of Forest Resources, internationally renowned Canopy researcher, and faculty member at the Evergreen State College. Dr. Nadkarni's 1983 PhD dissertation was a groundbreaking study of the forest canopy, the last biotic frontier. In it, she documented the effects of epiphytes on ecosystem-level nutrient cycles within rainforest canopies in the Pacific Northwest and Costa Rica. With continual support from the National Science Foundation and the National Geographic Society, she has climbed trees on 4 continents using ropes and mountain climbing techniques, construction cranes, and hot air balloons. In 1994, she co-founded the International Canopy Network and serves as its president. Her work outside the academy is creative and inspirational, reaching out to new partners from prisoners to artists. Her Sustainable Prisons project with the Washington State Department of Corrections has inmates directly participating in conservation projects, including cultivation of threatened mosses and captive rearing of the endangered Oregon spotted frog. In 2010, she received the prestigious Public Service Award from the National Science Board, the governing board of the National Science Foundation, and policy advisors to the President and Congress. A 2010 NSF grant funds her Research Ambassador Program to recruit and train other academic scientists to carry out non-traditional science and outreach. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nalini Nadkarni, who will speak on sustaining forests and sustaining ourselves, trees as providers and inspiration for our lives.
Well, thank you, first of all, very much for coming out on this cold and snowy night, actually snowier in Olympia where I live than here in Seattle. But I appreciate that you took your time to hear about this very important topic of sustaining forests and how we sustain forests and how they sustain us. When Tom called me to invite me to give this talk, I said yes with great joy because I love my connections with the School of Forest Resources. But after I hung up, I was suddenly overwhelmed with a sense of, like, how can I bring together the many, many different topics that relate to the sustaining value of forests? The ecological values, the societal values, the spiritual values, and the political values. And tonight what I'd like to do is to talk about all of those to a certain extent, sort of weave together the story of those values and how important they are to us. And I will start off just with a political value that has made this possible. And say what you will about the United Nations in terms of its effectiveness on the world political scene, but the decision to declare 2011 as the International Year of Forests, I think, is universally proclaimed as a great idea. Sustainability, of course, is part of what the International Year of Forests is all about. Basically, the UN is asking us to recognize how important forests are to sustain ourselves, not only in terms of the goods and services they provide, but also some of the other issues, the aesthetic and the sociological and the spiritual. One thing that actually Tom didn't mention in terms of my background in his introduction is that when I was in high school, I was a part of the Latin Scrabble Club. And that places me in terms of the gradient of geek to cool right up there in the geek. And so what I tend to do when I want to understand deeply the meaning of a word is to look up its Latin or Greek roots. And in this case, the word sustain comes from the Latin subtenerary, to hold, to keep, or to support fully from below. And indeed, I know all of you in the audience here, and all of you associated with the School of Forest Resources, know that trees do indeed support us fully from below. They occur around the world, from the taiga to the tropics. They occur in areas that are wildland and that are urban. And most of all, we have to consider that in addition to the fiber and the timber that they provide for humans, the scientists in this room and around the world know of the many ecosystem services that trees do provide for us, for oxygen, protection of soil, and habitat for wildlife, and basically the UN saying truly that we have much to celebrate forests for. Their longevity and their resilience in the face of disturbance imbue them with a silent strength that all of us can recognize. But we know that forests are not, in fact, impermeable to disturbance, that humans have brought them to a space where they are vulnerable, basically due to human consumption, to global climate change, and to fragmentation. I think even more dangerous is our increasingly lack of mindfulness about how these forests and trees support us, especially in the generation that will follow. This disconnect between forests and humans, I think, is what we need to overcome in order to truly create a sustainable relationship with forests. In my own lifetime of work and play in forest ecosystems around the world, I have really sort of centered on two goals. The first of those goals is to understand complex forests, their incredible diversity, their structural complexity, and the many interrelations that they foster. Secondly, an equally important goal that I have is to help sustain forests by raising awareness of their importance to others, whoever they might be. For the first goal, I use science. I've chosen science as the medium to understand trees and forests, and that really started here at the School of Forest Resources. But for the second goal, that is to share my awareness of trees and to try to raise awareness, I've had to go outside of science, to other fields, other approaches, and other ways of knowing. I recall quite clearly on a day a number of years ago when I was looking out over the forest canopy in a lowland rainforest, I had an insight that trees and forests really, to me, are tapestries. They are something that is complex, that is strong, that is useful, and that is beautiful. And as with real tapestries, they're made of pure strands of things that weave together to create something else, something beautiful, strong, and complex. I also came to understand that for my own efforts in which to sustain forests, I needed not only the single thread of science, but I had to pull together the threads of many other disciplines and ways of knowing in order to make something that is strong and that is resilient to change. And so the mantra that I have sort of taken on in terms of understanding forests, as well as raising awareness of forests, is this little poem by the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore. The tapestry of life's stories is woven with the threads of life's ties, ever breaking and joining. So what I'd like to do tonight is to tell you a little bit about three things. Number one, the Canopy studies, that is my base in science in terms of understanding the ecological importance and values of trees. Secondly, I'd like to link, that is to thread through the tapestry of the forest and how to raise awareness about it, how ecological values can weave together with other societal values. And finally, bring this together to talk about connections to sustainability. And before I jump into the canopy, I'd like to just share with you a little bit of my own background to help you understand how I have come to take on this approach. And first, I'd like to introduce you to my parents. My father was from India. He's a Hindu. He was a scientist, a pharmacologist, who came to the US as a graduate student. And the woman in the sari is my mother, Goldie Pechenuk. She's from Brooklyn, New York, an Orthodox Jew of Russian parentage who studied comparative literature, French and Spanish. So you can understand why I'm going for this mixed approach, perhaps. The other part of me that I think is important for you to know is that trees have been in my life for a very long time. As a little kid, this was me climbing a tree, and that was where I found solace, that's where I found solitude, that's where I found a sense of strength as well. When I graduated from college, I pursued my interest in field ecology and forest ecology by getting a job as a field assistant in Papua New Guinea. And in my early years of graduate school, I took an Organization for Tropical Studies course in Costa Rica, and it was there that I got very excited about learning about the forest and all of its complexity. When I first entered graduate school and got to know the College of Forest Resources at that time, I realized that scientists here tended to see the forest like this. They sort of missed the entire upper part of the forest canopy. And having been a child who climbed trees and appreciated the benefits of being high in the canopy, it seemed that it was very important to start studying the forest canopy. This was at first met with a bit of resistance because at that time there was no such thing as canopy studies. The work that the few people had started doing was considered sort of Tarzan and Jane stuff. And I well remember Dr. David Scott lifting up those glasses of his and saying, well, Nalini, with so many questions on the forest floor, why do you have to get into the forest canopy? And I wish you were here in the audience tonight because I think that there are a lot of questions that one can ask and answer in the forest canopy, that part of the forest high above the forest floor, a lot of insulation, great deal more sunlight in the forest canopy than what you find on the forest floor, tremendous diversity and interactions, which at that time were almost completely unknown. In fact, the forest was considered the last biotic frontier. I was fortunate in my graduate work that right at the time I was getting interested in forest canopies, people were developing techniques to get into the forest canopy safely and non-destructively. I learned how to shoot lines into trees and later developed a slingshot approach to do this. Using modified mountain climbing techniques, we could get up to the canopy safely and non-destructively. Within another decade, we had tools like forest canopy walkways, we had hot air balloons, and of course we have the marvelous Wind River Canopy Crane Research Facility, just 60 miles east of Portland, where researchers can get into that little gondola, go up and down, in and out on the jib. That jib can turn around 360 degrees, providing scientists for the first time with really safe and fantastic access to the three-dimensional volume of the forest ecosystem. Well, when you climb into the forest canopy, you really see a different world. You see a different component. You see a different thread of the forest by getting high up there. There's much more sunlight. There's a greater amount of wind. There are higher extremes of relative humidity and temperature. And for that reason, there are a large number of organisms that live in the forest canopy that you never see on the forest floor. And the work that I'll describe has taken place mostly in the temperate rainforests of the Olympic National Park in Washington State and in Monteverde, Costa Rica, a renowned cloud forest research site in Costa Rica. The animals that you see are adapted to canopy life. This sloth, for example, has very strong toes that it can clasp onto branches and basically hang on for a canopy or arboreal existence. There are literally thousands of insects that live in the forest canopy that are never encountered on the forest floor, ants, beetles, and the like. Pollination takes place there. There are snakes and other animals up in the forest canopy that, again, are not seen on the forest floor. For me, it wasn't the animals that held the great attraction to the forest canopy, but rather the epiphytes. Epi meaning upon, phyte meaning plant, so any plant that derives support but not nutrients from its host tree. It gets nutrients from mist and fog, the nutrients that are dissolved in droplets of mist and rain. And both in the tropics, where we see plants, epiphytes such as these large bromeliads, or the temperate rainforests, which are dominated by mosses and liverworts, these canopy habitats provide an amazing diversity for a wide variety of species of canopy plants. Those plants, in turn, provide habitat for many vertebrates, such as the marbled murrelet, which uses moss mats of old-growth forests along the about 60 miles inland from the coast for its moss bolsters, for its nesting areas. But in addition to the sort of plant-animal interactions, we know that the canopy is also a place where nutrient cycling takes place. And the plants that live in the canopy, we have found, are extremely efficient at sieving out water and nutrients that come in the form of mist and fog and rain. These water droplets contain a tiny bit of a particle around which water vapor has condensed, and therefore nutrients contained in that particulate are useful for plants and animals as well. Some of our experiments in Costa Rica have shown that over 60% of atmospheric-borne nitrogen is captured by these canopy plants, particularly the mosses and the liverworts, the non-vascular plants. The work that I started when I began my graduate work in the 1980s has been continued by many other students and colleagues. I'll just mention two of them here. Camila Tejo is currently a graduate student in the School of Forest Resources, and Dennis Aubrey is an advanced undergraduate at the Evergreen State College. And their work in the forest canopy and the temperate rainforest is really reinforcing and augmenting what we know as the keynote function that many of these canopy plants play for animals and for the ecosystem as a whole in temperate and tropical rainforest ecosystems. Well, as I became more aware through my own work and the work of others of the keystone nature, that is, the disproportionately important role that these canopy plants play in forest ecosystems, it seemed important to know what was going on in the rest of the world. And indeed, there are a large number of canopy sites that now exist around the world, both in tropical and temperate regions. And some of these studies, including those of my own, are trying to understand not only what their role is, but what happens when these canopy communities are disturbed. I started looking first at physical disturbance of these epiphyte mats. I basically removed mats from the branches, cut them out, and tried to figure out how long it would take for them to recover, whether they would be resilient or not. My prediction was, since these epiphytes are so lush, that they would return very quickly. And so I started coming back to measure how they had responded to this disturbance. The first year I came back, there was no regrowth. The second, the third, the fourth, the fifth. It wasn't actually until 12 years later that we got any sort of epiphyte growth coming back. So it was a very, very slow process rather than a fast one. The other thing that I had hypothesized is that the epiphyte mats would grow in from the side. They would simply encroach from the side like weeds do in your garden and move inward. And what we found instead is that the epiphytes grew from the bottom up and around that branch, probably because the bottom of the branch after a rainstorm is wetter than what you find on the top of the branch, which sort of bakes in that high area of insulation. And so what we found then was that, contrary to our expectations, the regrowth was very slow, and that it wasn't in the spatial pattern that we had anticipated at all. And this is the slide I like to show to remind us then, when we think about epiphytes and how lush they are, is that when it's gone, it's gone. And if you're very lucky, you might find growth coming from the bottom and growing up. So even though this is sort of a funny slide, I want you to remember it, because we'll be talking about moss resilience and recovery later on in the talk. Well, what is another form of disturbance that might be human-caused that people are concerned with in the canopy? And that question, of course, is global climate change. Because epiphytes occur at the interface of the atmosphere and the biosphere, that is where the atmosphere hits vegetation, and because these plants are dependent on mist and fog, global climate change has the potential of having a severely negative effect because of the longer periods of dryness, longer dry seasons, and less mist that we're going to be finding in tropical cloud forests. My students and I have done some work with doing transplant studies of epiphyte mats from the upper cloud forest down to areas lower on the mountain where there is less mist and fog. And we have found that, in fact, over a period of just 12 months, that we see a severe decline in both the diversity and the vigor of the canopy plants that live there. This work needs, of course, to be followed up, but it seems to us that this is a fairly strong suggestion that the predicted global climate change characteristics for tropical montane areas are going to have a very negative effect on the sustainability of these canopy communities and those that depend upon them. There are other human effects that are going on, deforestation, conversion of forests to agricultural land. All of these are going on at a very rapid rate, as we're all aware of. And as I sat looking at that tapestry of trees or of forest, I realized that I felt a very strong need to do something about that. And my action in 1994 was to start a nonprofit, a 501c3 called the International Canopy Network. The idea was to simply enhance communication amongst canopy researchers, educators, and conservationists in ways that would allow scientifically sound information to get into the hands of the educators and the conservationists who might need it to increase the sustainability of canopy communities and the forests that were dependent on them. So we started a little canopy newsletter, a quarterly newsletter, which we still have going, called What's Up. We consult to the media, like National Geographic. We write articles for kids magazines and for grown-up magazines. And we essentially, I think, have been very successful in delivering information about forest canopies to people who want to read about them. But within a few years, I realized that the people with whom I was communicating through the International Canopy Network are those people who already understand that trees are important, that forests are absolutely critical to our continuing survivability. And so I really wasn't getting out very far from the ivory tower in carrying out these interactions and activities of the International Canopy Network. I really wanted to find a way that I could get to people who, a little girl, for example, who might have grown up in this kind of a habitat rather than the kind of habitat that I grew up in, climbing trees. And so, again, I sort of put myself up into that, looking across that tapestry of rainforest, and I began thinking about the different ways I could link and tie and connect what I know about the ecological values of forest canopies to other threads that could link in together to make a tapestry of understanding of the importance of these forests. And so what I'd like to do with the sort of the next chunk of time in this talk is to tell you about 4 of these threads, 4 of my attempts to link the ecological values of forest canopies and forests in general with health values, aesthetic values, spiritual values, and social justice values, so that those together might weave a stronger tapestry of understanding. And I'll start with health values. There's an obvious connection between trees and medicine. We know that many medicines are derived from trees. There's one right here that comes from the Pacific Northwest, the Pacific yew tree, from which the drug Taxol has been extracted from its bark. And this has been called one of the most important anti-tumor, anti-cancer compounds that have been developed in the last 50 years. So that direct link between trees and human health, I think, is a very easy thread to connect. But I think that there are other ones that have to do with health, and these are more about sort of the environmental psychology of health and health-giving areas. We know that hospitals are very stressful areas. We don't have control over what's going on with our bodies when we're in there, or the bodies of our loved ones when they're in there. And there has been some very interesting work that has been carried out, started in the 1990s by Roger Ulrich, a behavioral psychologist, who did some very interesting measurements by comparing the success rates and the recovery rates of patients that were in a room that looked out and had a tree view, and those that had just a view of a concrete wall. These were the same patients, that is, they had the same operation, a gallbladder removal. And what Roger Ulrich found was that over a 6-year period, those who had a view out the window had significantly fewer days in the hospital, fewer nurse complaints, fewer complications, and used fewer narcotic drugs. And so this promoted the idea that the actual view or vista of seeing trees or seeing views out of nature can actually enhance human health. And although we might be skeptical of this, there are actually now a number of companies that create views of trees and sky out of non-existent windows in hospitals, because of course not every hospital has the benefit of having trees right outside the window. So for a fairly pricey price, a hospital administrator can get fake views of trees either as a window or as a scene on the ceiling, thus promoting this idea that in fact views of trees, views of nature, reduce stress, and enhance human recovery. I think that's a pretty important value. Another important value concerns spirituality and religion. And many, many people hold spiritual traditions and religious traditions as extremely valuable in their lives. And Hermann Hesse actually related that sense of spirituality of trees when he said, "Nothing is holier, nothing is more exemplary than beautiful, strong trees." And I, of course, share this sentiment. And in trying to make a connection between spirituality and religion and the ecological values of trees, I embarked several years ago upon a journey of trying to deeply understand how trees fit in to the religious traditions of world religions, and a desire to tell people of those religions about what I discovered. So, for example, since many people here in the United States have the Judeo-Christian tradition as most strong, I was able to look at the Old Testament, and immediately the first page, basically the second verse of the first book of Genesis, in that very passage, we learn about two trees, two very important trees, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And I was very excited that it was so easy to sort of find this, and being a Hindu Jew, I really didn't know the Bible that well, and so I decided to download the Bible, the Old Testament, from the web, and I did a search for the words tree and forest, and got a lot of data. It turns out there are 328 references to the words tree and forest in the Bible, and so I simply categorized them and made this histogram: symbolic and aesthetic use, analogy to life in God, verses that describe practical use, location descriptions, tree loss being bad, and tree biology. And with that information, I was able to understand that, in fact, in the Holy Scriptures of Jews and Christians, trees and forests play a very prominent role in really all important aspects of the human lives of the people who believe in these scriptures. I went to some of the Native American traditions and found that there was a tremendous respect for and use of trees within forests to make traditional masks and so forth. Those are actually made of wood. And in Eastern traditions, of course, forests are viewed as places of tranquility, of renewal, and of sacredness, of something that's deeply spiritual. With that information, I was able to invite myself to churches and synagogues and temples to tell the congregations about what I had learned about the central place that trees and forests play in their own spiritual lives. There were a few closed doors at first because, not a lot of Hindu Jews around in terms of having our own churches, but the Unitarians actually were the first ones who invited me in to share their pulpit, and I was able to give a number of sermons about this topic in a number of places of worship of all kinds, from Buddhists to Baptists in the South Sound area. I was met with great enthusiasm. People invited me to their tree planting activities. They gave me hymns about trees that I had not known about. And so this connection between trees and spirituality turned out to be a thread that was very easy to tie together. What about aesthetic values? Trees obviously have inspired art and music for centuries and centuries, and it's a very easy draw, again, or a very easy connection between trees and aesthetic values. I decided to try to explore this in a fairly formal way by staging a number of what I call Canopy Confluences. In these confluences, they lasted about a week each, and they were staged in different primary remote forests in Costa Rica and here in Washington State. I invited a set of forest ecologists who were familiar with the science of forests, and I also invited a set of artists, musicians, poets, dancers, and others who could perceive and appreciate and communicate forest canopies and forest ecosystems in ways perhaps that scientists could not do. I'll just show you a couple of examples of the artwork that came out of that. This is a wonderful piece called Ether by Bruce Chow, who's the chair of the sculpture and glassblowing department at the Rhode Island School of Design, who joined us on one of these confluences. This is just sort of woven together leaves or branches and sticks that he put up there, and over the course of 2 months, it started falling apart. And he simply documented that project and that process because he had learned that forests are very dynamic. He had learned from the scientists during the Canopy Confluence that trees and branches are falling down all the time. They're not static at all. And so this was Bruce Chow's way of expressing it as an artist. We had a gallery exhibit of the two-dimensional and three-dimensional artwork that was created during one of these Canopy Confluences, and accompanying those pieces of art were information about the biology and the science of the components of the forest that were described and communicated by the artists themselves. I interacted with a wonderful dance group, a modern dance group called Capacitor. The director, Jody Lomask, was very interested in making a rainforest dance she called Biome. I took her and her whole troupe down to Costa Rica for 10 days. They climbed trees. I told them about strangler figs, about insects, about glass frogs, and they created an amazing dance, which we have since performed in San Francisco and here in Seattle. And with it, we tried to convey the complexity and the fragility of these forests that she had visited. We had musicians that came to the forest canopy, wooden flute player, a guitarist, an oboist, and a rap singer. And of course, everybody loved the rap songs about the forest canopy the most. And so that turned into another project. And the object of that project, called Sound Science, was to engage at-risk middle school kids from Tacoma with the forest ecosystems of the Pacific Northwest, but doing so through the medium, through the ambassadorship of a professional rap singer named Caution, who's up there in the corner. He is a really remarkable rapper. He's an ex-con. He has since come back to Evergreen and gotten his degree. The kids thought he was just magic. And so when he picked up a stick and started rapping on it, they really got into it. And when I started describing forest ecology, it just didn't have the same effect. We adjourned every afternoon into the sound studios at Evergreen, and the kids themselves got into groups. Caution would give them beats, and they made up their own rap music about their experience in the field, their experience with the trees, their experience in the forest. And by the end of the week, they had made a CD which they could take home to their family and their friends, expressed in their kind of language, their kind of culture, and their kind of music. So connecting their values with the values of the forest ecosystem. The last area, or the last set of values I'll talk about, involves social justice. And this actually came about through my work with mosses, going back to this idea of the importance and the non-resilience of mosses. I don't know if you are aware of it, but here in the Pacific Northwest, there's a very large and very non-sustainable industry of harvesting moss as a secondary forest product for wreaths and baskets that are used by the floral industry. This is a $265 million a year industry. People go out into the forest and they just harvest the mosses off of it. And if you can remember how long it takes these mosses to grow back, remember that graph with the bald guy? It takes on the order of 2 to 3 decades. And so this is obviously not a sustainable industry. So it seemed to me, again, as a scientist, that what I could contribute to this would be to learn how to grow mosses or farm mosses in order to reduce the harvesting pressure on our beautiful old-growth forests in terms of harvesting moss. And it seemed to me that perhaps prisoners, inmates who are held incarcerated away from nature, away from growing things, people who have a lot of time and a lot of space, might be great partners in terms of learning how to grow moss. And in fact, that is exactly what happened. I began knocking on doors, not of churches only, but also of prisons, and offering to teach and help learn from the prisoners how to grow these mosses. It was a remarkably successful venture. The men that I started out with at the Cedar Creek Correction Center were extremely enthusiastic about it because it was something that engaged their intellect. They got to work with living plants and nurture them. The superintendent was very enthusiastic because suddenly the men were having different conversations. They were talking about the growth rates of Isothecium stoloniferum instead of Hylocomium splendens and which one was going to be faster, instead of thinking about their date of release. They designed their experiments. We got great results. I actually co-published a paper with an inmate as an author. Craig Ulrich was a senior author on a paper in the journal Environment, Development, and Sustainability. So it turned out to be a very successful connection, threads coming together to make that tapestry in an unexpected way. Because that project was so successful, I began giving lectures and also bringing in other scientists to give lectures. I gave one on trees and arboriculture, and we always bring in whatever we can in terms of nature to the prisoners so that they can touch and feel and smell and remember that important connection to trees and to nature, even though they are held within prison walls. Some of the lectures resulted in inspiring the prisons to take action to become more sustainable themselves. So we had a lecture on organic gardening, and within a month, the superintendent said, we're going to have an organic garden here at Cedar Creek, and lo and behold, it was put in. We're going to have a recycling operation going on, and lo and behold, they put that in. A beekeeper came in from Washington State University, and within several months we were able to get funds to have a beekeeping training program within Stafford Creek Correction Center, and they are making their own honey and making their own wax. And so that is, again, a connection to nature that was very successful. The other thing that grew from that, as our program began getting bigger and we began getting support, actually funding support from the Department of Corrections in Washington State, was I began to engage other scientists from other agencies and say, you know, how can you might you be able to bring your conservation projects, your restoration projects into the hands of these men and women who have time and space and a strong desire to help out? So sure enough, we were able to engage scientists at the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife to contribute to their Oregon spotted frog captive rearing program, and also to the Joint Base Lewis McCord project in prairie restoration, where the men began growing 200,000 plugs of 6 species of endangered plants. And because I think that this project really exemplifies this threading together, this pulling together of humans and nature, humans of whatever kind, in whatever way they are in their state of life, I'd like to show you just a short segment of that prison project and the conversations and the sounds and the sights of the people in there.
Well, C.O. Hickman was mobbing down the hallway one day, and he was talking about, yeah, I'm in charge of the frogs. I'm in charge of the frogs. I go, frogs? Because, yeah, they're going to be growing frogs here. I said, I'm your guy.
That to me is the best part. It's about being, a part of something bigger. Science is about that. I mean, it's about adding to a knowledge body that's bigger than any one person, any one lifetime, any one society. And so this is kind of a little microcosm of that. It's science in a different environment.
Within the Puget Sound region for prairie restoration, there's more and more work to do with fewer resources.
One of the things that Stafford Creek's going to really be able to help us out on is grow a lot of the plugs for the prairie species that we're going to be using to restore these areas.
We're doing 8 or 10 species. We're doing a total of 200,000 plants.
They're going to grow out a lot of the plugs for us to put in a permanent seed bed on Fort Lewis. And we're going to be able to collect that seed to use in our restoration projects.
See, like, this is a little too much, but you just use a very little. So like salty, like putting salt on your food or something, you know. I want to see how they come up.
Habitat restoration is critical, and it's going to be done by somebody somewhere. So why not utilize a facility where it's a very controlled environment and we have the resources to provide that kind of a research project or a science project, and it's a perfect match.
By being able to look at moss or raise frogs or help grow prairie plants, they suddenly become connected by this thin but very real ribbon to the outside world, both intellectually and physically. And to me, that's been very significant for people holding the ribbon on both sides, the prisoners who are locked in and the scientists who are entering into that world. And that's a connection that I think is really, I think, what the project is all about. So all of this work, I think, has gotten we've gotten a tremendous amount of media attention, a lot of attention from scientists, from different lay groups all over the world, really. And I think it is because of the sort of the nature of this connecting, that science is usually regarded in one spot and these other aspects of society are regarded as another. But I think when people start knitting together these different parts into this tapestry I'm talking about, a lot of people pay attention. from Science to CNN to Anderson Cooper, and I'm very proud to say even to Playboy magazine. So October issue of last year, for those of you who subscribe, you may have missed the little blurb we had about the Sustainable Prisons Project. But I do want to talk about science and about science's expectations. I know in an academic institution such as the University of Washington, which holds scholarship in such high regard in terms of the traditional ways that we achieve scholastic achievement, I want to just point out that John Holdren, who is now the President's Advisor for Science, recently made this statement: you should be tithing 10% of your professional time and effort to increase the benefits of science for the human condition. And I think he is saying here that it is okay for us scientists to spend at least some of our time in raising awareness about nature and about the work that we do in science with others. As Tom mentioned in his introduction, one of the things that I'm doing is to form this, what I call the Research Ambassador Program, trying to guide and train other researchers to do this kind of research, to reach out to prisoners, to preachers, and to middle school kids in at-risk situations, so that we might bring science and nature in a more direct way to these other audiences. So if you're interested in this kind of guidance and getting some help from we who've had some years now of doing this kind of work, I would be more than happy to talk to you about how that transfer might occur. I'm also very interested in hearing of the many activities here at the University of Washington that are moving towards connections to the community. I'm very aware of some of the work that's going on with the new College of the Environment, this active seeking of partnerships beyond academia and into the community that is so important not only for the community, but also for getting information and feedback from the community to the academic center of the University of Washington. So I think that, from my mind, I have been glad to be able to extend out these different threads to the different communities, different approaches, different perspectives. But I also think that this is, and it really looks, as you can see, somewhat analytical. Straight lines, different colors. It's very concrete, very easy to see, very easy to measure, very easy to write about, very easy to speak about. But in my work over the last 30 years of trying to understand forests and in trying to communicate and raise awareness of the critical nature of forests to humans, I have found that, in fact, we have to go even beyond this. I think there is something else that pulls trees to humans and humans to trees. And if we look at this wonderful, beautiful painting by Emily Carr, and if you'll pick up that piece of cedar that was on your chair, I want you to just sort of consider, for the rest of the talk, the idea that there are other threads that we can start weaving through that may not be measurable. They may not even have words to describe them, but nonetheless, they're very real. I think those words have to do with emotion, they have to do with memory, they have to do with links to childhood. They have all kinds of things that might not be measurable in the sense of science. And I'll just hearken to you some of the things that I've thought about in trying to consider where this other piece, these other threads might come from. I think that trees are linked to us in unspoken ways because we look like trees. We have sort of a similar body parts. We have a crown, we have a trunk, we have limbs, and so trees are in many ways like us. Trees give us a sense of time. They tell the seasons as really, I can't think of any other entity out there in nature can. And for that reason, I think they're very important. Their longevity is important. They live beyond our own generations. And for that reason, they remind us that life goes on after we do not. Trees, I think, encompass contradictions. And, contradictions are really interesting to human beings. So on the one hand, trees are these permanent, rooted, incredibly strong, straight entities. But trees are also these very fragile, bending, flexible entities that can be wiped out with a few degrees below zero. So trees are strong and fragile at the same time. The shape of trees, I think, is ubiquitous in our world. The shape of a tree can be the shape of a river system if we look at it from above. We hold in our own brains the shapes of trees. This is a dendrite from the bottom of our brain, a photomicrograph. So literally we have trees in our brains. These are called dendrons, which is the Greek word for tree, is dendron. These dendrites are what we hold as nerve endings in our brains. And this is my favorite picture. We even have trees in our hearts. And so this is the vasculature of a real human heart. And as you can see, there are sort of tree patterns within that. For all of those reasons, I think trees really provide a home for us. And I'd like to read a little poem because I think poems tap into that same area of emotion that science may not. It's by Michael Glazer. It's called The Presence of Trees. I have always felt the living presence of trees, the forest that calls to me as deeply as I breathe, as though the woods were marrow of my bone, as though I myself were tree, a breathing, reaching arc of the larger canopy, beside a brook bubbling to foam, like the one deep in these woods that calls, that whispers home. And because our home is not just a patch of forest, it's really the biosphere, I think when we talk about the sustainability of forests, we're talking about the sustainability of our home as well. And I want to just mention a couple of sort of activities that are going on that might be of interest to you if you're interested in connecting trees and sustainability and a sense of home and that sense of personal connection to home. A wonderful filmmaker named Ward Serrell is making a film called Tree Story. He's based here in Seattle, and he decided that he would basically allow people to tell their story about their tree, because he figures pretty much everybody has a tree, a special tree, a tree that they might have grown up with climbing, or maybe they planted a tree when their son was born, or there's a tree outside of their office that they see every day. And so he's using that as a basis to make this movie called Tree Story. And if you're interested in finding out more, we have more information about that. There's a wonderful website that you see up here. You can actually post your own tree story, and that will be incorporated into this effort. The reaction I had in terms of individual tree stories was to work with a computer programmer to make a program called Tree Links. And again, this goes back to the idea that we each have a special tree, and if we can locate it and share that location with others, we might get more of a sense of connection, a sense of interweaving of threads of the stories of our own trees. So I'm just going to walk you through Tree Links. Basically, we will just find a tree, and I found one. In fact, there's a tree that's very important to me here on campus. So let's go to the campus here in Seattle. And oh my goodness, there's the School of Forest Resources. And there's my tree. It's right outside Winkenwerder Hall, where I did my graduate work. And so when you go to the other piece of Tree Links, you can actually enter in the name of your tree and the location, and you can make a little comment. And so there it is. There's Winky. That's my tree. This large tree welcomes us to Winkenwerder Hall, where I did my graduate work, and it's a redwood species. So we can then link our trees, and by having lots of people enter in their own tree link tree, and we can see all of the special trees that occur in the United States and around the world. So, to go back to the beginning of my talk about the United Nations, the political body that sort of overlooks all of us, they have articulated, with their declaring 2011 as the International Year of Forests, they've articulated the importance of forests that sustain us and that support us from the bottom up. And I think that is kind of just an amazing thing to me that an entity such as that, this very bureaucratic, this international entity, would come up with that as what is important for this year in our lives. And I'd like to make one last comment about how we might contribute to the efforts that the UN has put in place in terms of reinforcing the sustainability of forests. And I'm going to tell it to you in the form of another poem. And this is a poem I love very much for a few reasons. One of them is that it is the only poem I know that is written from the standpoint of a tree. It's written with the voice of a tree. Secondly, it's a poem about, it's called Wanting to Move, and it's about a tree that wants to move. It doesn't know why, and it doesn't know how, but it wants to move. It wants to do something that is impossible for it to do. By definition, trees are rooted in one place. But despite all odds, despite all logic, and despite all science, this tree emotionally wants to move. And I think that that urge to do something about some of the problems that face our forests today, the difficulties that we have to overcome to help our forests be sustainable, is voiced in this poem. Wanting to move. Continually, a bell rings in my heart. I was supposed to go somewhere, to some other place. Where do you go? Will you take me with you on your horses down the river with the flames of your torches? They burst out laughing. A tree wanting to move from place to place? Startled, I looked at myself. A tree wanting to move from place to place? A tree wanting to move? Am I then born here to die here, even die here? Who rings the bell, then, inside my heart? Who tells me to go inside my heart? Who agitates me continually inside my heart? I look forward to learning the ways in which each of you answers the call of that bell that rings continually inside your heart. Thank you.